This is the story of a battle that should never have worked. A night attack from an aircraft carrier against a heavily defended fleet in harbor, launched by slow, fabric-covered biplanes that looked as if they belonged in a museum rather than on the decks of modern warships. Yet on the night of 11-12 November 1940, 21 of those biplanes took off from HMS Illustrious and flew almost 170 miles across a dark Mediterranean to Taranto. By dawn, 3 Italian battleships lay badly damaged or aground. The Royal Navy had demonstrated a new form of naval power, and the whole idea of how to strike an anchored fleet was forced to be rethought. That contradiction, impossibility and outcome, is what has fascinated me for years. I want to show you why the Fairey Swordfish, a plane routinely mocked as obsolete, became the instrument of something audacious and, in the narrow window of that night, effective. I'm standing in front of the last airworthy swordfish in the world. Up close, it almost looks fragile, a lattice of wooden struts, fabric stretched tight like a drumhead, a radial engine that coughs and ticks with a sound that belongs to a different age. The linen skin gives under a finger. The material feels warm, fibrous, absurdly domestic for a machine meant to carry a torpedo into a harbor ringed with searchlights and guns. I lift the corner of the fabric and feel the rib beneath it. The skin flutters with a breath of air, and the plane, small and honest, seems to protest at the idea of taking on modern armor. You expect it to be lightweight and modern, perhaps sleek enough to slip through flak. Instead, it is slow. It has an open cockpit, room for 2 or 3 men, and the kind of forgiving, low-speed handling that made it possible to land on short carrier decks. In design terms, it was an anachronism in 1940, a biplane in an age of monoplanes, but that very anachronism is the first clue to the paradox. Slow speed meant low stall speed, which in turn meant it could operate off smaller carriers and make very slow, controlled torpedo runs at night without necessarily cooking the torpedo in an impossible slipstream. The fabric skin and folding wings were not showpieces. They were practical features that let a nation with stretched resources put aircraft where they were most needed. The Swordfish was not invulnerable. Far from it. It was vulnerable to fighters, to searchlights, to radar-directed fire. Its survival depended on a constellation of factors: surprise, weather, skillful navigation across empty sea at night, the radar and anti-submarine screens of the fleet, and some number of things you simply could not control. The men who flew these missions knew this. Their equipment was never designed to make the impossible possible, but it could, in certain circumstances, tilt the odds. Operation Judgment began as that kind of tilt. In late 1940, the Mediterranean was a theater of acute pressure.
Italy had entered the war in June, throwing the Royal Navy into a strategic squeeze. Britain was stretched thin. The Mediterranean fleet, tasked with protecting the sea routes to Malta and keeping open the supply lines that sustained North Africa, could not match the numerical weight of the Italian Navy ship for ship. Malta was a linchpin. If it fell or was strangled, the supply line through the central Mediterranean would be in peril. The Italian fleet, based at Taranto and other ports, presented a danger not only by its existence, but by the mere possibility that it could break out into the central Mediterranean and challenge shipping. Confronted with this reality, the Admiralty had to be creative. One proposal was surgical. Rather than try to force the Italians into a fleet action where the Royal Navy might be outgunned, why not attack the fleet where it slept, in harbour? The idea was not entirely new. Carrier-based torpedo attacks had been considered before. What made Taranto audacious was combining carrier aircraft, night navigation, and torpedo tactics against a defended anchorage. The Royal Navy picked Illustrious as the launching platform, a modern carrier armored to survive hits, with an air group that included Fairey Swordfish specifically suited to slow, controlled torpedo runs. Planning for Judgment was methodical and meticulous because the margin for error was thin. Intelligence work had to map the harbor, where the battleships lay, where the anti-aircraft batteries were sited, what obstructions, booms, nets, barrage balloons, protected the fleet. Reconnaissance aircraft flew daytime sorties and took photographs that would be studied frame by frame. Analysts looked for the angles at which torpedoes could approach, the best approach lanes, and the night lighting of the harbor. The planners knew that a torpedo needed time to arm and to stabilize in the water. It needed a clean run without hitting an obstruction. That meant drops had to be at low height and at controlled airspeed, a precise mechanical ballet done under fire. Navigation was another problem almost as severe as the guns. The Swordfish was slow and had no sophisticated navigation aids by modern standards. Pilots and navigators relied on chart work, compass headings, and simple mechanical calculators that let you work out course and speed. Silk escape maps were folded in their cockpits, small, lightweight charts that could be read even if the cockpit filled with smoke. The round trip to Taranto and back was roughly 170 miles. At Swordfish speed, that meant hours in the air over open sea, a chance for weather to close in or for crews to lose their way. Night navigation required absolute precision. A few degrees off course could mean missing the entrance to the harbor and flying into unknown, heavily defended coastline. The composition of the strike force reflected these constraints. 21 Swordfish were selected. They would operate in 2 waves.
The first wave included flare droppers, aircraft whose role was to illuminate the harbor with parachute flares so that the torpedo bombers could see their targets and their release points. The second wave would make the torpedo runs themselves. Each aircraft carried not only the torpedo, but the human instrument to deliver it, a pilot, an observer navigator, and sometimes an air gunner. The observers carried diaries and logbooks, small repositories of human detail that would later let us stand inside the crew's experience. One of those observers was John Neal. His diary survives, held now in a museum archive, its pages still smelling faintly of old paper and oil. When I open the diary, his handwriting seems careful and compact, the entries short but vivid. He mentions the cold, the coffee and chocolate that kept the men alert, and the odd background noise of Italian opera on an intercepted radio as they flew. One of his lines, written in the hours after the raid, catches at the throat. Flying at 15 feet into the searchlights, tracer like a river, coffee gone cold, we dropped the torpedo and prayed. That is not a flourish, it is the plain way a man writes when he has been very close to danger. A logbook gives you coordinates and times in precise columns. A diary gives the taste of fear, the small superstitions, the particularities, a cigarette shared in the cockpit, a lighter that would not spark when needed, the way the wind sounded through the struts. I hold a silk escape map, the fabric cool between my fingers. It is a simple thing, a small square of silk printed with coastlines and notes. Silk because it is light and quiet. It does not crinkle loudly in a cockpit, and it folds small. The crew could stuff it into a pocket and still have room for charts, logbooks, and survival rations. A course and speed calculator sits beside it, essentially a mechanical slide rule adapted for navigation that let crews translate wind and heading into a track over the ground. It sounds almost quaint, but it is a machine of survival. In the hands of someone who knew how to use it, it turned a cold, dark night into a manageable problem. There are voices in the museum who help stitch together the technical and the human. Stephen Valentine, a curator who has spent years around Swordfish airframes and documents, points out how the low wing loading of the aircraft gave it an advantage at slow speed. It could fly lower and slower than almost anything else, he says, which is precisely what you needed to put a torpedo into the water cleanly. Matt Willis, another expert, reminds me that the old biplane's fabric skin and open cockpit were liabilities in the abstract, but made for a controllable aircraft on short decks, an important consideration on Illustrious with limited space. Their answers are short, clarifying, and always careful, admiration for the machine without romanticizing its risk. Yet, admiration alone does not explain the decision to send these aircraft into Taranto at night. The Admiralty had to weigh risk against necessity. The Italian fleet at Taranto included battleships that, if repaired or used offensively, could challenge convoys and cut supply lines. The Royal Navy, constrained elsewhere, could not afford to neutralize every threat in conventional set-piece battle. A successful raid into harbor promised disproportionate effect. 1 or 2 battleships damaged could be worth dozens of destroyers in terms of strategic balance. Still, the mission planners knew that the difficulty of a harbor attack was extreme. Anchored ships were protected not only by shore batteries, but by nets, booms, and anti-aircraft barrages designed specifically to defeat torpedoes and low-flying aircraft. Detailed reconnaissance was vital. Aircraft took photographs at range showing the arrangement of ships. Analysts marked the positions of coastal batteries and estimated the fields of fire across the anchorage. Intelligence officers plotted the angles where a torpedo could be delivered and the depth at which it could safely run. Torpedoes were finicky instruments. They needed a clean entry into the water and a run of several hundred yards to stabilize before they reached the target. The Swordfish, because it could fly very slowly and at low altitude, could, in theory, deliver the torpedo at the right height and speed. But in practice, the world is messier. Nets might be in place, a ship might be farther forward or astern than its photograph suggested, and anti-aircraft fire could force a run to be aborted. The decision-makers knew this. They also knew that meticulous planning could reduce, though never eliminate, the risk. Into this calculus stepped the human factor. The crews were experienced, some veterans of Fleet Air Arm operations in the North Sea and along the Channel. They trained for night operations, practiced low-visibility navigation, and rehearsed torpedo runs in calm waters. There was improvisation, too.
For example, some torpedoes had to be modified or their launching parameters recalculated to cope with the reduced drop heights available to carrier-launched aircraft. Those modifications were practical solutions born of necessity, not miracles. The success would depend on men executing precise routines under conditions that invited panic. Aboard Illustrious, the order went out and training intensified. The carrier itself was a hive of activity as crew checked aircraft, loaded ordnance, and plotted the routes. Commanders studied the maps and made a hard choice about timing. Night gave cover but also complicated navigation. They settled on a plan that used flare droppers to create a temporary daylight when the torpedo bombers arrived. The flares, parachuted down to swing slowly under a canopy and illuminate the anchorage, would expose the shapes of the capital ships and allow torpedo pilots to fix their bearings.
It was a risky trick. The flares would also betray the aircraft's presence, but the planners judged that the shock of a sudden, unexpected illumination followed by torpedo runs would disorganize the defenders' fire control. Among the pilots selected was Sub-Lieutenant Spike Spark, a name that seems to belong more to adventure fiction than to a gritty wartime roster. But he was real, a pilot who would fly with observer John Neal that night. Spark and Neal were paired because of complementary strengths. Spark's ability to keep the aircraft steady in the face of flares and tracer, Neal's skill at reading charts and timing a run. Another pair was Alfie Sutton and his pilot, Tiffy Torrance Spence, names that appear in logbooks and in later interviews with the men who survived. Alfie Sutton would later speak about the box barrage, a tight, coned pattern of anti-aircraft fire that tried to interdict torpedo approach lanes. There was a box barrage, Sutton said in an interview recorded years later. We flew into that box and we hit Littorio. It is the kind of plain, understated sentence that historians prize because it compresses danger, action, and outcome into a human voice. Admiral Cunningham, Commander-in-Chief of the Mediterranean Fleet, endorsed the plan. There were other senior figures involved, names that appear in the records with varying frequencies, including a Lumley Lister, whose role is sometimes referred to in the dispatches. The Admiralty watched closely. The signal traffic was brisk. At one point, the terse line, "Attack completed," would be sent through official channels, and later Admiral Cunningham would be recorded as calling the result most satisfactory. These are the small documents of state that historians bite on. They show how officialdom digested the immediate outcome, even while losses and damage were being assessed. The night of 11 November arrived with a mixture of anxiety and tout professionalism. On Illustrious, the Swordfish crews moved into their aircraft and checked their gear. The faint smell of engine oil, aviation spirit, and sea air combined with the sharp tang of cold on exposed skin. They were briefed on the route, a careful navigation that would take them across open sea to a turning point and then along a track into the shadowy mouth of the harbor. Fuel calculations had to be exact. Any misjudgment could strand an aircraft far from friendly waters. The pilots set their compasses, checked the lights on the instrument panels, and made sure the drop laden with torpedoes was secure. There was a quality of ritual to the preparations, a practiced choreography of men and machines that turned routine into survival. Takeoffs from Illustrious were not simple affairs. The carrier's deck was finite, the Swordfish heavier with their torpedoes, and the margin for overshoot small.
One plane taxied into position, the catapult mechanism. Actually, on Illustrious, the Swordfish would generally take off without a catapult, using the carrier's wind over deck in a running start. Offered its own tension. The deck's length was a sentence. You had to make it translate into flight. Engines roared, propellers chewed the dark. The first wave lifted off, one by one, into night that smelled of oil and sea spray. As the squadrons climbed, the task became solely about navigation and nerves. Pilots flew at low altitude over the swell to stay out of radar and to keep a visual hold on the horizon. In the cramped cockpit, the cold ate at the men. Some turned to coffee rations. Others relied on steady breathing and the mechanical cadence of the instruments. John Neal, in his diary, is terse but candid. Cold hands on the wheel, radio chatter odd with Italian music, sighted lights, heart thumps. The diary is not theatrical. It is the record of a man who has had to keep his head while everything around him sought to make him lose it. As the group approached the Italian coast, the crews encountered clouds that scattered the formation. Some aircraft found themselves separated, forced to fly by dead reckoning with only a compass and a map for company. The plan accounted for such contingencies, but no plan can account for the human claustrophobia of seeing only the instrument panel and the black ahead. At one point, one squadron disappeared into a bank of cloud and did not reappear for some minutes. Those minutes stretch and elongate in a pilot's memory into a lifetime. Weather was not an enemy you could outfight. It demanded accommodation. When the leading aircraft began the run-in to the harbor, the first wave turned on their flares. The effect must have been surreal for both sides. For the crews, an artificial daylight dropped down into the anchorage, revealing the vast gray hulks of battleships and the more prosaic shapes of destroyers and support vessels. For the defenders, the sudden pinprick of light in the dark would have been disorienting, the harbor suddenly obvious, the ships visible for the first time in hours. The flares did what they were supposed to do. They gave the torpedo planes the chance to see and to judge distances. They also gave the defenders a moment to orient. It is at this point that the margin between success and catastrophe is thinnest. The torpedo run demanded that the pilot approach at low altitude, keep the aircraft steady in the face of wind and tracer, and release the weapon at the right range so that it would enter the water at the correct angle and arm properly. Too high a drop would shatter the torpedo. Too low risked contact with the waves.
Contemporary accounts indicate that some pilots released at around 800 yards and descended to altitudes as low as 15 feet to ensure the torpedo ran true. A hair-raising maneuver in the dark with searchlights slicing the sky and anti-aircraft guns throwing up curtains of fire. Observers later described the sensation of the sea moving up to meet the aircraft, the sudden drop in temperature as the sea spray head faces, the metallic taste in the mouth that accompanies extreme focus. This is where human skill met technical limitation. The Swordfish's slow speed and forgiving handling made low-altitude, low-speed torpedo runs possible in a way that faster monoplanes could not manage safely from carriers at the time. But the aircraft's strengths were not guarantees. Each run was an act of calculation and courage, performed under observation and under fire. The men who flew them were not daredevils for the sake of danger. They were trained operators pushing the limits of their equipment and their nerves because the strategic situation demanded it. As the first wave completed its illumination task, the second wave, the torpedo bombers, slipped forward, one by one, into the cone of flares. The night bloomed with pinpricks of trail smoke and occasional bursts of anti-aircraft fire. A few aircraft were hit, a few reported near misses. The coordination between flares and torpedoes had to be nearly perfect. Radio silence was often maintained to preserve surprise, which meant that pilots had to trust each other's timing and stick to the plan. Somewhere below, the shadowy forms of Italian crewmen must have been scrambling, rails clanking, voices rising. The moment of action compressed into a series of movements: line up, steady the aircraft, judge the range, release. And yet, even as I described the choreography, the reader should not imagine a smooth, mechanical ballet. It was jagged, chaotic, terrified, precise in equal measure. Tracer lines cut across the sky like angry threads. Searchlights found a target, then lost it, then found another. Some torpedoes ran true, some did not. Some aircraft returned with their skins unmarked. 2 aircraft did not return. The loss of those men is recorded in the terse language of official reports and in the quieter phrases of friends in their diaries and letters. They are not a footnote. They are part of the moral ledger of the night. We stop here, poised at the moment when the torpedo runs begin to play out in the dark, when flares illuminate the gray mass of the harbor and the slow, purposeful line of swordfish arcs inward. The tension is complete. Months of planning, weeks of reconnaissance, a decision by commanders to accept extraordinary risk, and a squadron of aircraft and men who have trusted their instruments, their charts, and each other to deliver the effect.
The rest, the hits, the damage, the signal traffic that would later say most satisfactory, follows from here, but it is also contingent on the sharp edge of chance, weather, and human error. In the next moments, the delicate machine of the plan will encounter the brutal reality of guns and steel and water, and the question that hung over the operation from the start: how could such an apparently obsolete machine succeed against a modern fleet in harbor, will be answered, imperfectly and consequentially, by events that are about to unfold. The torpedoes are in the water now. For a handful of minutes, everything is reduced to the immediate geometry of man, machine, and sea: an aiming point, a steady hand on the stick, a release lever that must be pulled at a single, brutal instant. Below, searchlights stab and circle, anti-aircraft fire stitches the darkness, tracers carve lines that seem to belong to a different world. For those who remained aloft that night, the work was an exercise in micro-decisions, trimming the throttle to a whisper, keeping an eye on a sight picture that could be spoiled by a single wavering flare. If this story is gripping for you and you want more of these deep dives into episodes of naval and aviation history, do subscribe. There's more material like this in the series, and I'll leave sources in the notes so you can follow the primary documents yourself. One of the clearest survivors' impressions comes from the men who were there. John Neal's diary, which I handle with gloved hands in a climate-controlled archive, comes back to the immediate sensory world. Searchlights like fingers, the flash of shells, the smell of burnt cordite. We dropped and held our breath. That line, short and unornamented, compresses what a pilot and observer lived through in those crucial seconds. Alfie Sutton's later interview gives a different, terser image, the box barrage, a geometric volume of fire designed to make the torpedo channels unusable. We flew into that box and we hit Littorio, he said. 2 human voices, 2 ways of saying the same thing, peril and purpose combined. What happened in those minutes would be assessed at dawn. The first light showed a harbor that no longer matched the intelligence photos. Hulls rose at odd angles, smoke drifted from ruptured plates, and a number of capital ships were no longer seaworthy without repair. By the time naval staff had compiled aerial reconnaissance and reports from the fleet, 3 of the Italian battleships were effectively out of action, some beached to avoid sinking, others listing with flooded compartments. The immediate official traffic was characteristically laconic. A signal went through the channels. Attack completed. In the Mediterranean command rooms, as figures moved between charts and teleprinters, Admiral Cunningham's dispatch carried a restrained triumph, most satisfactory.
Those 2 phrases, one terse, one slightly amused in its understatement, tell you how the Admiralty framed the result, a painful but usable success. We must not turn the mess of metal and fire into a simple narrative of British genius against Italian complacency. The attack's outcome balanced on contingencies. A number of torpedoes ran accurately, others failed to find targets or struck less critical portions of hulls. Some torpedoes may have struck mud or shallow seabeds rather than plating, sparing a ship the worst. The barrage and confusion among Italian gunnery crews certainly mattered. A misdirected battery, a delay in bringing accurate predictors to bear, the confusion caused by sudden illumination, every small lapse compounded into strategic gain. At the same time, it is true that 2 aircraft failed to return. Men died that night, and their loss is recorded in both squadron lists and mourning letters. Those losses are gravestones in any appraisal of the operation's courage and cost. What the raid demonstrated, in the clearest operational sense, was vulnerability. A capital ship at anchor, massive, armored, seemingly immobile, can be, under the right conditions, as exposed as a convoy on the open sea. Taranto showed that harbor defenses, nets, and booms were not vulnerable. They could be compromised by surprise, by careful reconnaissance, and by aircraft that accepted the constraints required for success. The Swordfish's slow speed, once considered a liability, here became an attribute. It permitted controlled, low-altitude delivery that faster aircraft could not perform safely from a carrier at the time. The fabric-skinned biplane, for all its fragility, could do a job that modern fighters of the period could not. The commander's immediate judgments flowed into longer debates. Some in the Royal Navy argued that Taranto validated a new template for naval strikes. If a carrier could put aircraft within operational range and maintain surprise, anchored capital ships could be neutralized without a surface fleet engagement. Admirers of carrier warfare pointed to Taranto as evidence that naval aviation had matured beyond merely scouting or fleet-scale air defense. Carriers could project force into harbors. Others countered that Taranto was a product of a specific set of conditions, geography, weather, intelligence failures on the defending side, and should not be taken as a universal model. That qualified verdict carries over into the famous conversation linking Taranto to events in the Pacific. It is a line you will see frequently drawn in histories. Japanese planners watched Taranto closely, and lessons from the Mediterranean may have helped shape thinking that culminated at Pearl Harbor. Historians debate the strength of that link.
Some argue that Taranto was a proof of concept that the Japanese Naval General Staff studied with interest. Others insist that the Pacific theater's logistics, distances, and target sets were different enough that Taranto played only a partial role in Japanese decision-making. The careful way to state it is this: Taranto informed a conversation among navies about the possibilities of carrier-launched strikes on anchored fleets. It did not, on its own, determine everything that followed in the Pacific. To claim that would be to overstate the evidence. Within days, British and international commentators turned their attention to doctrine. Fleet commanders rethought harbor defenses, navies examined their use of barrage balloons and nets, and technicians studied how to prevent torpedo arming issues and reduce the risk of shallow water impacts. The tactical takeaways were practical and immediate: improve night detection, rehearse coordination between flare and torpedo flights, and re-examine how anti-aircraft fire could be concentrated to deny low-level approaches. The strategic takeaway lingered. Carriers had begun to make battleship-centric doctrines feel obsolete. But again, it is necessary to be careful. Doctrine changes because of many factors: industrial capacity, strategic geography, political priorities, not single moments alone. Returning to artifacts helps keep the human and material strands tied. In the Fleet Air Arm Museum, I handled John Neal's logbook, each entry a neat line with time, heading, and remarks, the clinical spine that sits beneath a diary entry's human tremor. The silk escape map I held earlier is now under glass, its folds smoothed by time, its printed ink slightly mottled. Matt Willis points to the course and speed calculator beside it and explains in 2 sentences how a navigator would translate wind and heading into a ground track. It's simple geometry, he says, but it's geometry under stress. The simplicity of those tools is part of the story. In a world without satellite navigation, survival hinged on mechanical skill, a steady hand, and the ability to read the sea by night. Museum curators also remind us of the operation's moral ledger. Catherine Cooper brings up the missing aircraft and the small cluster of families who received telegrams and would spend the rest of their lives puzzled by silence at a dinner table. We keep the diaries and logbooks because they are people, she says. They are not only tactical records, they are human lives. The machine and the man are inseparable in these stories. Her note is a plea against turning Taranto into a mere case study in tactics. It is a historical event populated by real losses and ongoing grief. There were immediate practical consequences for the Italian fleet. With several battleships damaged or beached, the Regia Marina's ability to undertake large-scale sorties into the central Mediterranean was constrained for months.
That, in turn, relieved some pressure from Malta convoys and the convoys bound for North Africa. But the strategic picture remained complex. The Mediterranean had multiple choke points, and air power from Italy, Germany, and within the island chain continued to shape convoy viability. Taranto altered the tactical balance at sea for a season. It did not by itself determine the long arc of the Mediterranean campaign. The human side of the aftermath is often distilled into a handful of images: men handing out coffee on the carrier deck when crews returned, mechanics working through the night to repair damaged airframes, signals officers clacking out terse messages that would be read back at Admiralty. One of the small items in the archive is a printed message from the squadron: 2 aircraft missing. Our CO and SCAR, much sorrow. That fragment, the ellipsis suggesting a fuller private grief, cuts to the heart of wartime reporting. Official communications had to be succinct. They could not carry all the sorrow. Yet in those ellipses we sense the lives disrupted by the night's events, families waiting, comrades who would not cross another threshold. Dates and counts are important here. 21 Swordfish, 2 waves, Illustrious as the launching platform, and a round trip of roughly 170 miles. Torpedo runs that required release at extremely low heights. Contemporaneous accounts give figures down to 15 feet, underscore the bravery and the technical daring involved. 2 aircraft missing is not a marginal note. It is part of the price paid. To reiterate facts matters because it keeps the narrative anchored in evidence rather than myth. Over the months and years that followed, Taranto entered the curricula of naval officers and the files of foreign navies. Photographs of the damaged hulls were circulated. Planners argued about the merits of armored flight decks versus more aircraft capacity, about the deployment of carriers inside contested waters, and the need to couple them to a supporting reconnaissance and fighter umbrella. For those historians who study the evolution of naval thought, Taranto is a pivot point, not because it single-handedly invented carrier warfare, but because it exposed, vividly and publicly, the latent power of an aircraft launched from sea to strike where steel seemed immovable. Back in the present, in the shadow of the last flying Swordfish, I climb into the cockpit for a demonstration flight. The plane's controls are tactile: wood, metal, fabric, no plastic panels or digital readouts. Straps hug my shoulders. The wind is already a presence, even before the engine coughs. The pilot beside me, an experienced volunteer who flies the Restoration, thumbs the starter. The engine comes alive with a sound that is at once archaic and utterly alive, a rhythmic coughing that vibrates through the ribcage of the airframe.
In the open cockpit, the air is immediate, cold on the face, a precise intrusion that cuts and clarifies. We roll forward and the deck seems very narrow from my seat. The takeoff is gradual and intimate rather than explosive. The Swordfish lifts as if it has been released gently from the sea itself. Once airborne, we descend to a low circuit over the water to give a sense of the sort of approach the wartime crews flew. The sea under us is a patchwork of dark and silver. The sound of the engine and the wind is all-consuming. In those few minutes, I can understand, in an embodied way, why a pilot might focus on the sight picture and shut out fear. There is no insulation here.
The world is a direct set of sensations. The plane demands attention to trim, to the pressure of the control column, to the subtle interplay of throttle and attitude. It is not comfortable. It is, however, perfectly suited to the task for which it was repeatedly pressed. That experiential moment connects me to the men of 1940. Their cold was colder, their flares more terrifying, their guns more random. Yet the materials are constant: a silk map, a mechanical slide rule, an engine whose rhythms set a human pulse. In the flight's simplicity, there is a kind of clarity. The Swordfish was not miraculous. It was a particular tool with limits. Under certain conditions and in the hands of skilled men, it could do something that at first look seemed impossible. At the level of honor and memory, Taranto resists simple moralizing. Men took lethal risks, some returned, some did not. The success of the mission cannot be used to paper over the very real tragedies that accompanied it. But it is equally important to honor the ingenuity that made it possible, without turning the event into an instrument of national myth. Courage and improvisation, careful reconnaissance, and cold technical calculation combined in a specific moment to produce a consequential result. That complexity is the reason historians return to Taranto. It resists tidy summaries. If you go to the Fleet Air Arm Museum, you can see many of the primary pieces that make the story tangible. John Neal's diary is there, the silk map is there, a few of the squadron's logbooks are preserved under glass. For those who study the material culture of war, these objects are a way to feel the gap between the official reports and the lived reality. Stephen Valentine shows me an ordnance crate stamped with a serial number that ties it to those torpedo flights. Things like that let us move from what the signal traffic says, attack completed, to what one man felt in his fingers, the vibration of the engine, the cold on a gloved hand. Historiographical debate circulates around causal chains. Some narratives simplify Taranto into a single, decisive stroke that rewired naval power. The more careful account treats Taranto as a significant episode that illuminated emerging possibilities while remaining embedded in a wider strategic context.
It nudged thinking. It did not, on its own, redraw all maps. The Japanese attention to Taranto is one part of the evidence that carrier-launched air attacks on anchorages were possible. There were other influences, other doctrines, and other calculations that fed into the Japanese plan for the Pacific. Saying influenced is not the same as saying caused. As I step down from the Swordfish, I carry two impressions with me. The first is technical. Small, adaptable machines operated by men with a set of simple but well-practiced skills can, in the right synthetic conditions, deliver effects that seem disproportionate to their apparent capabilities. The second is human. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the narrowness of focus in the presence of it. Improvisation is not improvisation alone, but improvisation steered by training, discipline, and a common aim. The story of Taranto, Operation Judgment on the night of 11-12 November 1940, is not a tidy morality play. It is an episode where contingency met intent and briefly produced a strategic payoff. 21 Swordfish took off, 2 aircraft did not return, and 3 battleships were put out of action or severely damaged. The raid changed how navies thought about anchored fleets and confirmed the potential of the carrier as a platform for offensive strikes into harbors. It also left scars, families grieving, men changed forever by the night's violence, and a professional community that would spend years debating the right balance between daring and prudence. In the end, the line in the title, that it was a raid that should never have worked, captures an essential truth about Taranto. On paper, the parameters were stacked against success. Yet in practice, a confluence of meticulous planning, improvisational adaptation, skilled flying, and, not least, a very particular machine, the Fairey Swordfish, produced a result that was, in its way, extraordinary. To call the operation miraculous would be to obscure the very human decisions and technical competencies that engineered the miracle. Better to say that it was improbable, heroic, and historically consequential. If you're interested in seeing the primary documents I handled and learning more about the wider implications of carrier aviation in World War II, there's a link in the show notes to the Fleet Air Arm Museum and a playlist where we go deeper into Taranto, the Swordfish, and the broader evolution of naval air power. Visit, read the diaries, and judge the fine grain of history for yourself. We remember the men and machines together, for the bravery of those who stepped into that box of tracer and light, for the awkward truth that a fabric-covered biplane could, under certain conditions, tilt the strategic balance, and for the hard lesson that the apparent obsolescence of a tool can, when used inventively,
become its greatest strength. That is why the raid still intrigues us.
It should never have worked, and yet, for reasons equal parts human and mechanical, it did.